So let's get on with tonight's subject, which is the break-even point. And one of the things I wanted to cover about what is break-even point, well, obviously the graphic, if you saw it at the beginning, explains what it is. It's when costs equals revenue for any activity within the business. Now, what's unusual about garages is it's not easy to determine where the break-even point is. Because if you sold a commodity, so if you say you're a factory making widgets, you could easily determine your widget point because you'd have your fixed costs and then the costs to produce every widget. And then you would just basically look at the number of widgets produced, and then you would add the cost per widget to the fixed costs. So you'd have a variable cost and a fixed cost, and the variable cost would depend on how many widgets you made, and the fixed cost would be fixed. It would never change. And then you could easily calculate it and have a spreadsheet is typically used, or you can draw a graph and you can see where at what point, how many widgets you would need to make to break even, where you would either making a profit or a loss. And that is the break even point, that number of widgets. And then for every widget you made on top of that, hopefully you'll be making a profit. Obviously, it becomes a little bit more complex than that, even in a simple manufacturing setting, because possibly after a certain number of widgets, costs would either increase per widget or decrease per widget, depending on various factors. But it's a really useful tool so that when you can look at your business, if you were making widgets, you could decide how many you would need to make, and therefore is the market going to sustain the product? How you would know when you were in profit, when you were, how many you need to make to get into that profit. And it's really interesting when you look at it from that point of view, is what is your margin of safety? How many could you make, which is one part of the margin of safety. So can you make enough to make yourself make a profit? And how many could you sell, which is the other element of the margin of safety, which is an important consideration in business. So what this means for independent garages is, how do we determine what I consider the break-even point for a garage? It's not as straightforward as a manufacturing situation, because we only really have one thing to sell, and that's our time and some parts. And the parts are very, very difficult to predict unless we only sell one thing. We only have one service that we provide. Now that is, it is a possibility. If you only do MOTs, but you don't do any repairs, you would be in a very, very simple situation. You'd have your fixed costs, your cost per MOT, and you'd be very much like a manufacturing situation, like a factory. You could work out your break-even point very easily. But most independent garages don't operate like that. And so you may have a situation whereby you have a break-even point for different products, which is totally fine. Or you may have a break-even point, as I would suggest here. A good way of looking at break-even point for independent garages is when your fixed costs for the garage and your variable costs for doing each hour's labor are covering the cost of operating the garage. We ignore the parts when we look at this. All we're looking at is the costs incurred in doing the work. So imagine fixed costs. If you don't know what fixed costs are, we'll probably have more training on some of these financial terms as we go forward, when we start looking at the finance in a bit more detail as these subjects go on. But fixed costs are basically the costs that you would have on a bank holiday. So everything would still incur costs, but you wouldn't be open. You wouldn't be earning any money, but you would still have the heating on, the lights on, etc. You'd still be paying your staff. They're your fixed costs. That's a good way of looking at your fixed costs. Everything, all the costs you would incur on a bank holiday when you should be open, but you're not, and no one's in work and everyone not earning any money. So they're your fixed costs. Your variable costs. Now, in this situation, what I'm talking about here are the costs of doing the work, the costs of doing labor. So if you look at your books, and you will need to get very, very familiar with your books if you become a master in business, is you need to start looking at where the variable costs come from. So these may be miscellaneous costs, for example. So a cost that you probably don't attribute to the job is a cost that a business incurs. Could be gloves. So your latex gloves. The more work you do, the more latex gloves you use. So that's a variable cost. So what you need to do is look at all the variable costs. So all the costs that are not directly attributable to a job. They are costs that are incurred in doing work. So if you didn't do any work, like on a bank holiday, no one's in work, you wouldn't use any gloves. So that's a variable cost. Yeah. All of these variable costs, you have to look as a total and then divide them by the number of hours worked. And then you could then have a variable cost per hour. And therefore you could attribute variable cost to each hour worked. I hope that makes sense. Your fixed costs will always be the same. Your variable costs change depending on the level of activity within the business. If you look at this in a graph, you have a fixed cost, which is always the same, and a variable cost, which increases as the amount of work you do increases. And where there's a crossover point where you are neither making a profit or a loss, that is the break-even point. That is the number of hours you would need to work to neither make a profit or loss. And then every hour you work after that is effectively profit for the package. And you need to know what that break-even point is. What can you do to influence the break-even? You can increase your labor rate, reduce your costs. So that can be your fixed costs and your variable costs without sacrificing quality. That's the key thing is we don't want to be penny pinching. We want to look at where we can trim our costs while still maintaining the quality of service that we provide. That's the key with any cost savings. We can see that from looking at our fixed costs, we will then know how far into the week we go before we make any money. Remember now, we're not including parts and the money that we make on parts, our margin or our parts in this. And it's a very, very common situation for independent garages to find themselves in, whereby they only make profit because they sell parts, which is not where we want to be. That's a situation we need to rectify within our businesses. We need to be breaking even before the end of the week. And our margin of safety is the number of hours that are left after the break-even point. Now, we have to consider when we look at the break-even point. So let's say a business has worked out that let's say they've got two fitters. Let's make the maths reasonably simple. They've got two fitters and their break-even point is at 40 hours. When they get to 40 hours, they're neither making a profit or a loss. They are breaking even 40 hours. And there are two technicians. There are 80 hours available to work every week. So it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume then that in this business, once they have sold 40 hours, once they've done 40 hours worth of labor and sold that to customers, every hour after that would become profit. But that's ignoring the efficiency of the business. How many hours are sold compared to the hours worked? And that's where it starts to, when you start to look at your margin of safety, making that business more efficient would make the business more profitable. It always does, but it doesn't change. It will have an effect on break-even if you make a business more efficient. But what happens is you increase the margin of safety because that business appears to have a margin of safety of 40 hours because it's got 80 hours it can sell and its break-even point is at 40 hours. But that relies on that business being more than 50% efficient, because if it is only 50% efficient, it only ever sells 40 hours, which means all week it works just about breaks even, which unfortunately is the situation many garages find themselves in. You want to get into a position whereby you're breaking even, let's say by Thursday. So Thursday and Friday are profit, or at least by the middle of Thursday. Therefore, the hours that you sell be after that every week means that you're in profit. So calculating your break-even point is a really, really important task. And then knowing what your margin of safety is. And to know your margin of safety, you need to know how many hours you sell typically each week. To know your variable costs, you need to know your total costs and the number of hours worked or hours sold. And then you need to know your fixed costs to do this calculation. Because typically what business owners like to do is have a visual representation of their fixed costs and their variable costs for their break-even point, because it shows up on a graph. And there you can see where you're, have a look at that and say, right, if I need to sell 32 hours every week, that means that my margin of safety is 8 hours if I'm 50% efficient. I have two techs. And how you can influence that, you can play with the numbers a little bit, but your hourly rate, increase your efficiency, look at how that will affect your break even. I've been Andy Krupp. Hopefully that's been interesting.